It started with a missing Amazon package, but it ended with something far darker. In a neighborhood where power wore a smile and rules were enforced selectively, one man became a target not because he broke the rules, but because he didn't fit the image of who belonged. A package vanished, accusations followed, and suddenly the truth was twisted to protect authority and punish visibility. What looked like entitlement quickly exposed a quiet, dangerous bias hiding behind HOA rules and suburban respectability. But the moment Daniel realized who took his package, he had no idea how ugly this would become, or how much it would reveal next. Daniel Foster lived a quiet, predictable life in Maple Ridge Estates. He worked from home, paid his dues on time, and kept to himself. His days were measured by video calls, delivery notifications, and the small routines that made suburban life feel safe and controlled. He chose the neighborhood because it promised peace, tree-lined streets, tidy lawns, and the unspoken assurance that if you followed the rules, you would be left alone. But Daniel learned quickly that rules didn't protect everyone the same way. From the moment he moved in, he felt watched. Not openly confronted, not loudly accused, just monitored. Small things became issues. Package sitting too long. Car parked slightly off. Porch light that drew attention. None of it seemed serious, yet each complaint carried an edge, as if Daniel's presence itself required justification. At the center of it all was Patricia Harrington, the HOA president who treated authority like ownership. She walked the neighborhood with purpose, documenting, measuring, correcting. To her, Daniel wasn't just another resident. He was a problem that needed managing. And while the violations were written in neutral language, the way they landed never felt neutral. Neighbors noticed it too, though few said anything out loud. Silence was easier than becoming the next target. Daniel tried to stay invisible. He documented everything, followed every rule more carefully than anyone else on the block, and told himself it would pass. But there was a quiet understanding settling in. This wasn't about compliance. It was about control, about who was allowed mistakes and who wasn't. And on the day that small Amazon package disappeared from his porch, that unspoken tension finally found a trigger. What Daniel didn't realize yet was that this missing package would pull the mask off the neighborhood and expose something far more uncomfortable beneath the surface. The notification arrived quietly, the way most turning points do. A simple alert confirming a delivery. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Daniel barely glanced at it before returning his focus to work, trusting the same routines that had always carried him through the day. Minutes later, another alert buzzed. This one different. Movement detected. He opened the camera feed and watched disbelief turn into something colder as Patricia Harrington stepped onto his porch with practiced confidence. There was no hesitation, no concern, no confusion. She scanned the street, lifted the box, and walked away as if it already belonged to her. First, Daniel tried to rationalize it. Maybe she planned to return it. Maybe she was securing it like she claimed to do for others. But deep down he knew better. This wasn't protection. It was possession. And when he reviewed the footage again, something clicked. This wasn't just about a package. It was about power being exercised without fear of consequences. As Daniel quietly saved the footage, his frustration grew into something sharper. He thought about every citation, every note, every inspection that never seemed to happen to anyone else. Other neighbors had packages sitting out for hours, sometimes days, untouched. His couldn't last 20 minutes. The rules hadn't changed, but the way they were enforced had always felt different when it came to him. When he shared the footage with a neighborhood group, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Stories poured in from residents who had stayed silent for months, even years. Packages that disappeared. Items held for safekeeping and never returned. But what stood out wasn't just the theft. It was who it happened to most. New families, renters, people who didn't look like they'd always belonged there. The pattern was impossible to ignore once it surfaced. As the video spread beyond the group, the tone shifted. What started as a missing package became a public reckoning. People questioned why authority was allowed to operate unchecked. Why suspicion always pointed in one direction. Why certain residents were treated like guests in a neighborhood they paid to live in. And as attention grew, so did Patricia's desperation to control the narrative. Violation notices multiplied overnight. Complaints appeared out of nowhere. Every movement Daniel made felt watched, documented, weaponized. The same systems meant to protect residents were now being used to intimidate him into silence. It was clear she wasn't just angry, she was threatened. Because for the first time, her actions were visible, and the image she'd carefully maintained was starting to crack. What terrified Daniel most wasn't the retaliation. It was the realization of how easily this could have ended differently. If there had been no camera, no footage, no witnesses, a word from her would have outweighed his every time. The truth wouldn't have mattered. And as pressure mounted and authority closed ranks, it became clear that the confrontation everyone was waiting for was no longer avoidable. Because when power feels exposed, it doesn't retreat quietly, it strikes back. The confrontation happened in broad daylight, right in the center of the neighborhood where everything was supposed to look perfect. Patricia crossed the street with a stolen package clutched in her hands, her movements sharp and frantic, as if returning it would somehow undo what had already been exposed. Neighbors slowed their cars. Curtains shifted. Phones quietly lifted. This wasn't private anymore. Her anger wasn't controlled. It spilled out in gestures, in wild accusations, in the way she positioned herself as the victim while standing on someone else's property holding what never belonged to her. What made the moment unbearable wasn't just the theft. It was the entitlement behind it. The certainty that she could take, accuse, and shame without consequence. That the rules would bend for her because they always had. Daniel stood there, calm on the surface, but inside everything felt dangerously fragile. He knew how easily situations like this could turn against people who looked like him. A raised voice could become a threat. A lie could become a report. Authority had a way of deciding truth based on familiarity, not facts. And Patricia leaned into that comfort, drawing attention to herself as wronged, as exposed, as humiliated, while completely ignoring the harm she had caused. Then reality caught up. The footage was undeniable. The witnesses were too many. The narrative she had controlled for years unraveled in real time. The same neighbors who once stayed silent now watched closely, recognizing something they had ignored for far too long. This wasn't about one package. It was about how power had been used to single out, intimidate, and punish under the cover of community standards. As authorities stepped in and the weight of consequences finally landed, Patricia's certainty cracked. The confidence drained from her posture. The performance couldn't hold. And in that moment the imbalance shifted. Not because the system suddenly became fair, but because the truth was impossible to bury when everyone was watching. Yet even as the situation reached its breaking point, Daniel knew this wasn't the end. Accountability was coming, but so was the aftermath. And what followed would reveal just how deeply this injustice had been rooted all along. The neighborhood eventually returned to its quiet routines, but nothing felt the same. The rules were still posted. The lawns were still trimmed. Yet the illusion of fairness had cracked, and everyone could feel it. Daniel remained in his home, but the sense of safety he once believed in was gone. He moved through the same streets knowing how close he had come to being erased by someone else's authority, protected by silence and familiarity. What stayed with him most wasn't the package or the public confrontation. It was how easily the situation could have ended differently. Without proof. Without witnesses. Without people willing to speak up once the truth was visible. The system hadn't protected him. Visibility had. And even then, justice only arrived because the injustice was impossible to ignore. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something larger. How power is often trusted more than people. How suspicion follows certain bodies. How rules become weapons when bias hides behind them. Racism doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it wears a badge, a title, or a smile, enforcing order while deciding who belongs and who doesn't. Daniel's story spread beyond the neighborhood because people recognized it. They had lived versions of it themselves. Being watched more closely, questioned more harshly, punished more quickly. And while this time the truth surfaced, countless other stories never do. Lost without footage, without witnesses, without a platform. The impact wasn't just accountability. It was awareness. Conversations started. Silence broke. And for some, discomfort finally replaced denial. Because the real issue was never one entitled person. It was the system that allowed her to act without challenge for so long. So the question isn't whether racism still exists in our communities. It's how many moments like this pass unnoticed before someone finally decides to speak up. When injustice hides in plain sight, will you look away? Or will you be the reason it's exposed?